Chairman Mao, Jamie Howe, Ho Chi Minh, Asif Din, Václav Havel, Graham Saville, No Surrender, Percy Fender, Guerrilla Cricket.
Chris Morris breaks records. Maxi sparks a bidding war again. The big overseas spinners go unsold. Sachin's baby gets picked up, as does Sachin Baby. Those are the headlines from the mini auction for this 14th edition of the IPL. But with gavels hammering, paddles rising, blank spreadsheets being opened by team owners, and money flying in and not in, and not out of owners' bank accounts, the main headline for us here on Guerrilla Cricket is the non-selection of some big English names. I am Nakul Pande, and I'm joined for this rundown of the Unselling of the English by Jack Hope from the Cricket Podcast.
Good evening, Nakul. It's my first IPL auction, this one, so I really enjoyed it.
It never leaves you. I live tweeted the whole damn thing for Guerrilla Cricket last year. Not possible this time because I was stuck in a shorthand lecture, unbelievably enough. It's amazing how the worlds collide. But yeah, plenty of money floating around even in this mini auction. 2 of the top 5 IPL bids ever for Chris Morris and for Glenn Maxwell. Some big bids as well. KM got them going for a hell of a lot of money as well. The main headline, of course, that will get the headlines is Chris Morris being the most expensive auctioned player of all time. But we will get on now to the main talking points. A lot of people, including myself, thought that Alex Hales and Jason Roy and Adil Rashid would be big money, big name, big draw cards for IPL franchises, all world-class performers. Jason Roy and Adil Rashid, key parts of the white ball setup. Alex Hales possibly should be, possibly shouldn't be. And we knew he wouldn't be going to KKR because of Owen Morgan, but we thought he'd be going somewhere. But not a bid, not in any of the accelerated rounds of bidding either. Jack, firstly, how much of a surprise was it to you that those 3 didn't go unsold? And why do you think that might have been?
So let's start with Hales, because I wrote an article for Guerrilla Cricket about Hales. And in that, I explained why Hales would be picked up. And I went as far as saying which 2 teams would likely bid for him.
Which 2 teams were they?
So that my article, Delhi and RCB, I think, off the top of my head. Obviously he wasn't picked up, and that leads to the question why. I mean, I think the answer to that is nobody knows, if I'm honest. I don't think there's really a rational process that you could go through to explain why, for instance, Steve Smith was picked up by the Delhi Capitals and Alex Hales was left unbid for. Based on what we knew the teams needed going into the auction, there were multiple sides and 2 Delhi and RCB who clearly had an opening batter shaped hole in their lineup, and for neither of them to have taken the opportunity to fill it with Alex Hales is, I think, quite astonishing. And I'd probably go as far as saying someone has done their job badly. I mean, Royal Challengers Bangalore's auction strategy in general has been chaotic. But Delhi Capitals, they're generally quite a well-run team. And I think going into this auction, they probably had the second best overall squad behind the Mumbai Indians. And of course, they made the final last year, so there's some evidence of that there. But it looked like they just needed to add a little bit more firepower in their batting lineup, and they'd be right up there with Mumbai Indians. And I just... not selecting Steve Smith screams that somebody just hasn't done their due diligence, if you like, in that team's analytics department.
Well, we'll come on to the analytics in a second, but you're right. They did pick up Stephen Smith going for another, I guess, anchor player, another conservative player. And I've been racking my brains to work out how on earth he's going to fit into an 11 that already has a few too many of those types of player. I wasn't completely sure that Delhi needed another top order batter. I think it was more of a case of getting the ones they already have to fire. But you could certainly see the logic behind it. RCB have been looking for one for a while. They tried Aaron Finch last year. They ended up with Dave Parikal and Josh Philippi at the top of the order, which worked out to some extent. Parikal, obviously a very exciting young player. Josh Philippi, a limited player at this stage of his career. But I have this persistent thing about English players setting their base price too high and scaring people off. You look at a lot of players who end up going for big money, and they go in with pretty low base prices. Let's pick out an example from this year. Moises Henriques goes in at 1 crore, gets 4.2. Let's find out some other big examples. Dan Christian goes in at 75 lakh, comes out at 4.8 crore. And there's some other examples around there. Piyush Chawla goes in at 50 lakh, 2.4 crore. And there's a few earlier on in the auction as well. Adam Milne goes in at 50 lakh, 3.2 crore. Now, I completely understand why big name players and English players who get a decent amount of money, admittedly Hales doesn't have a contract anymore, but even the white ball contracts for Roy and Rashid are decently well paid. They're playing an awful lot of cricket this year. I understand that you want to be recompensed for your money. And I can understand that in a mini auction year, you might look at 3 players who don't actually have particularly good IPL records. Adil Rashid has somehow never played in an IPL. Hales and Roy have a few times and have never really done a great deal. There was that one year where Jason Roy was one of about 5 openers at Gujarat Lions and was struggling to make a bit of an impression. Alex Hales has had bits and pieces. I can understand why you might want to be conservative. But then Alex Hales sets his base price at 1.5 crore, which maybe is a little bit high. Then Stephen Smith goes in at 2 and comes out at 2.2 crore. I think we'll move to the analytics now, I think, because it strikes me actually that the IPL might be the least analytically focused of any of the major T20 leagues in terms of recruitment.
I'd probably disagree with that, but on a franchise by franchise basis. I think some of the franchises in the IPL are the best in the world, and some of them possibly contend for the worst. If we look at Hales, I think to understand why I think it's such an aberration that someone didn't pick him up, maybe it would be good to go back and look at the 4 teams that were probably in the market for a top order overseas batter. So prior to this auction, the Chennai Super Kings, Delhi Capitals, KKR, Kolkata, and Royal Challengers Bangalore all released overseas opening batters. Now, from that list, Kolkata Knight Riders, captained by Morgan, you can immediately strike them off of the list. There's more chance of you being picked up by Kolkata Knight Riders than Alex Hales at the moment, quite frankly. CSK, they only had 1 overseas spot to fill, so they were probably also unlikely to pick up Hales. But the other 2,
by the way, they didn't. They ended up going for Moeen Ali.
They did, yes. They did,
and that made some sense given that he fills a number of potential holes in the middle order. He's an off spinner, turning the ball that way. Most of their spinners turn the ball the other way. He's a bit of a triple threat and works very well, assuming that everyone's allowed to play on their home ground. That he works very well in those conditions in Chennai.
Yeah, sure. So back to the 2 teams though. So Delhi Capitals and RCB, both of them struggled to find an opener or an opening combination that could score quickly and maintain that scoring pace. Should they make it through the power play, and for both of them to look past Alex Hales in favour of other options is, from an analytical point of view, just a strategic point of view, clueless recruitment, basically. Yeah.
I mean, look, RCB were also in the running for Stephen Smith, and I tweeted out that if you're bidding for Stephen Smith and Glenn Maxwell, whatever your plan was the wrong plan, because that is a rather confused strategy. RCB went big after Maxwell, and I sort of admire the commitment to the Galactico philosophy of RCB. If you can't be good, at least be fun. And Virat Kohli, AB de Villiers and Glenn Maxwell is fun. And to be fair, it does fill a hole to some extent because they found a sort of opening partnership last year and they needed someone after Virat Kohli and AB de Villiers who could score quickly and could take the pressure off them a little bit and free them up a bit more. Glenn Maxwell does that. He's an extra spin bowling option rather. He's a wonderful fielder. Obviously, he's a big name and a big draw. I think that's a little bit more excusable. Let's move on from actually, in fact, before we move on from Alex Hales, you've talked about analytics a few times, and I know on your podcast, the Cricket Podcast, you had Dan Weston, who's one of Cricket Twitter's biggest analytics guys. We know some of the numbers with Alex Hales in terms of what he's done in international cricket and what he's done in various franchise leagues, including the BBL. Can you give us any underlying numbers behind Alex Hales that might either explain why teams might have thought there were cheaper options, or actually make the case for the fact of his non-selection even more baffling?
So I think it's actually. Well, I mean, let's take a look at his last 2 years in T20 cricket, or 3 years. So since 2019, his averages have been 31, 32 and 43, and the strike rates for the corresponding years have been 141, 152 and 160. So if anything, the guy's trending upwards. The 10 T20s he's played this year have been in the BBL, which is a lower standard than the IPL. But interestingly, it usually carries with it a recency bias. And this is one of the things Dan was talking about with us, that he couldn't really explain as well. Was normally, if a player does well in the BBL, they not only go to the IPL, but they go to the IPL for more money than that player is actually worth. So I don't think I can really find you any numbers, Nakul, that provide a solid reason for why a team would have avoided Alex Hales, other than kind of a perception, I suppose. Probably based on his relationship with Owen Morgan, that has perforated the IPL bubble, as it were, and led to a kind of groupthink amongst IPL franchises, which has informed their decision not to pick him.
I can think of a couple of counters to that. Stephen Smith has played the IPL and is something of a known quantity and might be seen as a safer option, not in terms of his personality, but in terms of at least you know what you're getting with him in the conditions and in the tournament. And I think there is more conservatism in IPL franchise picks, and it's creeping into Delhi Capitals in particular, which is a bit of a shame, really, because I think a major part of the success of their rebranding has been to play a kind of fearless form of cricket with these young, exciting players. Now they seem they're very disjointed at the top order. They've got Rishabh Pant and Shimron Hetmeyer, and to some extent Marcus Stoinis, around an increasingly safe-looking batting lineup that looks like it's going to put an awful lot of pressure on Rishabh Pant. And even Pant fell victim to this last year. His strike rate in the IPL was considerably lower than it has been in any other year. Hopefully his recent success, or his success since that IPL, will have given him the confidence to just be his own man, which ultimately will help Delhi. I think that the mini auction has caused everyone to be a little bit more conservative this year. I'm not wholly convinced that the personal issues with Alex Hales make that much of a difference, particularly given some of the personality that we do have in this year's IPL, and Indian cricket in cricket in general. I'm not sure that plays all that much of a part.
That might be true. In which case, to address the point on conservatism, that's even worse of a decision, in my opinion. That's not only. I don't think there's really an argument you can make for conservative selection in terms of batters in T20 cricket. There's just not a mathematical way you can explain to somebody why Steve Smith would be a better choice than Alex Hales, unless you think that Steve Smith's previous average performance in the IPL is somehow going to mean or versus Alex Hales' lack of performance in the IPL or lack of experience in the IPL is somehow going to be a massive differentiator between the two. For Delhi to have made that decision, it's in my mind, it just displays a complete ignorance of what it is that you need to be looking for when you select T20 batters.
I would tend to agree with that. I would tend to think that they have gone away from what has made them somewhat successful in the last couple of years, and I would tend to think that it's it's other formats and kind of traditional cricket thinking taking too much of a priority when it comes to T20 selection, and possibly just DC just not backing themselves enough, not trusting themselves enough, and I think learning the wrong lessons from last year in terms of.
I think that's a great point. I think they came very close to winning, and the lesson they seem to have learned is that they needed a bit more star power or
solidity.
Something intangible, solidity, experience, someone who's good around the boys, to quote from another cricketing podcast. But that really isn't fundamentally what wins your cricket matches. I'm afraid Delhi Capitals, and I think what Alex Hales could have brought might have done.
Yeah, indeed. We'll move on from Hales. I mean, he was the big ticket. Jason Roy, another English opener who might well have been a useful signing for someone. Again, we talk about those usual characters: RCB, CSK to some extent. KKR, I suppose he could have been a direct replacement for Tom Banton. I think here my thing about him going in with too high a base price might apply. 2 crore for a player who has actually not had a very good recent run for England and who has never had a significant impact on the IPL. Maybe if he'd gone in with a 1 crore base price and let everyone else bid him up, he might have been a better option.
So I'd say there's probably 2 things on Roy. One, I think it's a great point about the base price and the sort of lack of experience. Everything that you've just said is one of the flags that I would have if I were at one of the auction tables. The second is there's probably still a little bit of doubt around his ability against spin. And selecting a guy who has maybe a reasonably well-known weakness in that area for the IPL is probably not that wise a move. I think I think Roy would have been a better choice than Smith, but in my rankings of IPL auction players, Roy would have been some way below Hales, I think. So I think this is more. It's sort of more understandable that a team wouldn't pick him up at a 2 crore base price, because you have that combination of a lack of experience with questionable recent results and maybe question marks around on that spin point as well.
Yeah, if you're looking at pace dominant pitches, Mumbai didn't need him. Frankly, they've already got Chris Lynn as a backup opener. They let Evan Lewis go because they weren't getting enough game time out of him. And KKR, they've gone another way with KKR. In fact, KKR didn't really. Shakib Al Hassan is really their only major pickup at this year's IPL auction. And they already have too many players at the top of the order potentially. It's very hard to work out what KKR's top order is going to be. And move on to someone who, in theory, has all of the attributes to be a world-class IPL performer, Adil Rashid. But we've seen this year, Adil Rashid didn't get picked up. Mujib didn't get picked up until the later accelerated bidding round. Sandeep Lamichhane didn't get picked up, who has had some good IPL performances for the Delhi Capitals. We saw him barely get any game time at all in the UAE last year, which is even more spin-friendly than the Ferozshah Kotla, as was in Delhi, if you can believe it. Again, I think the base price might be a factor. I wonder if the shoulder is a factor. And I think also on the base price, I think there is an element of these two players are setting these high base prices because is an element of, if we're going to spend this extra time playing cricket, we want to be well recompensed for it, which you can understand. But you wonder if, given how keen England are, quite rightly, I think, to get their main players playing in the IPL, they might have said, do you want to just drop it a little bit and see what happens?
Yeah, I think it's a real shame for the tournament in general that we won't see Adil Rashid playing in the IPL, and I think again you're onto. I think you've touched on the reason that England players have set their base price so high there, and that is that there's less financial requirement for them to be in the IPL than there is for most other nations. Adil Rashid, I think he probably is unlucky in that there are a boatload of very good Indian spinners who are available for not that much money and don't take up one of your overseas slots. I think the other possible problem for Adil Rashid this year is that in this particular mini auction, the requirement that many of the teams had was pace bowling. And that, we saw that in some of the crazy auction prices, to be honest. But that's where their attention was. And with a without even their full 8 overseas slots to fill, that left like very few or very little room for one of them to take a punt. And it probably would have been a punt, to be honest, on Adil Rashid, who hasn't played in the IPL and may not get into the side anyway because of the competition with the local talent. Maybe a slightly clunky, but possibly illustrative case study here would be Imran Tahir last year at CSK, probably their best spinner in the CSK team. But he found himself behind Piyush Chawla and obviously Ravi Jadeja in terms of players who CSK actually wanted to pick because they needed to use those overseas slots elsewhere.
Yeah, Imran Tahir barely played until the last few games of the season. I think it was in the second last game of the group stage that he finally took his first wicket. This having been leading wicket taker the year before. And that, again, in the UAE, even more spin-friendly than Chepauk in terms of the number of spinners you will need. Yeah, it's unfortunate the timing for Adil Rashid. Had this been a mega auction and everyone's kind of back in, maybe teams start looking at the performances of their overseas spinners and think, right, we might want to take the punt on the very well backed up statistical punt on Adil Rashid, given his numbers in white ball international cricket in recent years. He doesn't have a great deal of T20 franchise experience anywhere, really. Certainly not recent and worth talking about from that point of view. So I think this was more understandable. Again, it took Mujib, who has had success in the IPL, didn't play much at Kings 11 last year because of their weird overseas balance. Sorry, Punjab Kings, and eventually got picked up again to make Sunrisers Hyderabad even more Afghan. Sandeep Lamichhane, who I was at a Delhi Capitals game when he was in Delhi when he was playing, and he's a superstar in Delhi. There's a big Nepali population in northern India, and he's almost like a local boy. But he falls into that weird category of almost being like a local boy, but not. See, because he takes up the overseas slot, it's hard to justify, right? So again, you can see that one a little bit more logically. And you talked about some of the. We'll move on as we come to the end of this little reaction pod for some of the players who did get picked up. Some of the English players who did get picked up. So Darwin Milan got himself his first IPL gig. Again, probably a beneficiary of going in a little bit cheaper.
Yeah, I think so. I was actually a little bit surprised that he ended up at Punjab Kings. I thought they'd be one of the teams that didn't necessarily suit the skills he brings to the table. But I think it's good to see that he was selected from an England fan's perspective. I don't know how much game time he'll get though. What do you think?
I mean, Punjab aren't short of top order batters. Frankly, I mean, he does quite balance. He would balance out quite well, because the problem they had last year was that Mayank Agarwal and KL Rahul would get them off to a brilliant start in the power play, and then they'd just sort of stop, which is why they had to bring in Chris Gale a little bit. Obviously, Maxwell's performance didn't really help. But Milan is the complete opposite. The classic thing of him being 10 off 10 balls or whatever, 20 off 20 balls, and then scoring a 60 ball or 70 ball 100. So that actually could balance it quite well if they can fit him in with Curran and with Gale and with all of the fast bowlers they bought this year. Who they got?
Jai Richardson. Jai Richardson and
Riley Meredith.
Yeah, I mean, I think Jai Richardson might be one of the signings of this auction. To quote Dan Weston, a classic 2-2 bowler, which is basically a guy who can bowl 2 overs in the power play at the beginning and 2 death overs. And he can bat a bit. Tipped by Dan to be the most expensive player. So I think he'll definitely play. Puram will definitely play. And then probably Gale and either Jordan or Meredith as the extra bowler, so, which might squeeze Milan out of that. Their opening day starting 11 anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, venues and fixture lists notwithstanding. Moeen we just talked about at Chennai, which seems to work out quite well for them. Looking at the other English players who got picked up, Tom Curran getting picked up was a little bit of a surprise.
Yeah,
again by Delhi.
I'm not really sold on Tom Curran, to be honest, and I'm not really sure what Delhi needed him for. I don't really understand why Delhi would trade away Daniel Sams and then buy Tom Curran.
For more
hopefully
money.
It works.
For more
yeah,
money.
Exactly. Hopefully it works out for Delhi and Tom Curran. It's always good to see English players do well in the IPL, but that one's a bit puzzling to me.
Yeah, again, I've been looking at Delhi's lineup and trying to work out, there's a fair possibility that Shimron Hetmeyer doesn't play very many games for them this year. They might only be able to play one very often. Anrich Norkir and Carissa Rabada, who were absolutely stunning for them last year. Tom Curran had a bad IPL in 2020. He's been neither economical nor a wicket taker for England in the last few years. A player with a massive ceiling in terms of his hitting ability, in terms of his ability to bowl various types of slower balls. He can hit those Yorkers really well at the death, but he's going through his first career slump. And you're right, if you want a squad player, it seems like an odd choice of squad player. I do wonder actually with Stephen Smith, going back to that, whether Delhi went in for him cheap, thinking someone else might come in.
Well, RCB did go in, didn't they? Maybe they thought they'd pull a fast one on RCB and get them to spend a lot of money on. Well, I don't want to describe Steve Smith as useless, but
on an anchor player who doesn't really fit the profile of what a lot of teams need right now.
A much more polite way of putting what I was thinking in my head. Yeah.
Yeah. Again, Stephen Smith is not an elite T20 player. We can certainly say that. Rajasthan Royals invoking the Yunad Cut principle and releasing and buying back Liam Livingstone. Hard to see him getting a game, really. No,
but I do think he'll be a good backup. I think they've got rid of Steve Smith and they brought in Liam Livingstone, who's really not that much of a downgrade on Steve Smith, and also doesn't come with the kind of requirement to play every match. If Stokes, say, goes down injured, would it be the end of the world if Liam Livingstone stepped in instead?
Yeah, I mean, previously he's ended up stepping in when Rajasthan lose all of their players towards the end of the tournament. That might not happen this year because we've heard today that England might keep some of their players on who are in the final stages of the IPL for the rather than playing the New Zealand series. Not sure whether Rajasthan will be troubling the playoffs, so it might be irrelevant. And the final one to talk about is Sam Billings, again at Delhi, who are becoming very, very English. This one could actually work. Again, if they can find a way in for him to play, and I'm not really sure how they do that.
Yeah, I don't hate this. Again, I think he'll probably start as a backup, but he has looked better and better in white ball cricket over the last couple of years. Did you see his tweet about his girlfriend?
I did see that. Yeah, for those of you who aren't quite keeping up with that, he tweeted he and his girlfriend were watching the IPL auction, and he tweeted that his girlfriend turned to him and said, "Why aren't you a bowler?"
Well, he got a gig in the end, so I'm sure he'll be happy with that. I think for Delhi, that's probably the one area they've upgraded. I think Billings is a better wicketkeeper batter than Alex Carey, who they had last year. And I would expect to see him in a game or two over the tournament. I mean, there are some question marks around players like Shimron Hetmeyer and whether he'll play, Steve Smith, whether he'll play. So I wouldn't rule out Billings having a little bit of a role, but I think it will be a role rather than a starring role.
Yeah, indeed. The role player is an interesting one in franchise building. A role player means kind of a utility player in football, someone who can kind of slot in at various different positions, which is sort of what he is for England. But he did have something of a breakthrough summer in 2020, or another breakthrough summer. Unlike some of the other players we've talked about, Roy, and to a lesser extent Hales, is a very good player of spin, has the array of sweeps and reverse sweeps that makes even Joe Root look limited. Relatively speaking. A couple of players who didn't get picked up this year. Reece Topley didn't get picked up despite going in quite cheap, which might have been a reasonable pickup for somebody if you were looking again for a 2-2 bowler, big, tall man, obviously very injury prone, but potentially very useful to someone. And a few players obviously didn't enter the IPL this year. Joe Root, Harry Gurney didn't enter the IPL this year. Tom Banton didn't either. I think that's it as far as the English roundup is done. A couple of the other big ones. Kyle Jamieson, who we've talked about. RCB breaking the bank for Kyle Jamieson. Possibly so Virat Kohli doesn't have to face him. I think there was an awful lot of he is terrifying, and you can understand why he terrified people. He's sort of the cricketing equivalent of Erling Braut Haaland, in that you look at him and think, Jesus Christ, I don't want to face him. Get him on my team. KM Gautam going for a huge amount of money to the Chennai Super Kings. Adam Milne becoming yet another Antipodean pace bowler to grace the ranks of the Mumbai Indians. They again just sort of buy bits around the edges and make them work. And Shakib Al Hassan back in the IPL. But Jack, we'll close off by thinking who's done the best bit of business, and who would you back to win this year's tournament?
Right. Well, I'll start with who I'd back to win the tournament, because it hasn't changed from who I'd back to win the last tournament. That's Mumbai Indians. I think they've got the best team. I don't think they really needed to do much at this auction to maintain their dominance. And what they have done is sort of recruit some backups to the best team. I think the team that will improve the most based on who they picked up is probably the Rajasthan Royals. They spent an awful lot of money on Chris Morris. But if he plays all 14 games, and I think there's a bit of an if around that one, I think he fills two really glaring holes, or big holes in their lineup. In that he can bowl death overs, which they massively struggled with. I think they were the worst death bowling team in the tournament, despite having Jofra Archer last year. And he can provide a little bit of power in that kind of 7-8 area, which they, I mean, let's be honest, they desperately needed as well. So I think just him coming in should turn them into playoff contenders from the team that finished last in 2020.
Yes, indeed. Albeit the table was incredibly congested. I was mildly surprised actually that Rajasthan didn't go full Galactico and go for Maxwell as well, because that would be a very them thing to do. They used to be the Moneyball team. Now they just throw the money at the wall and see what sticks. I think that in terms of who's going to win the tournament, again, I agree with you. I don't think anyone's strengthened enough, obviously, to knock Mumbai off their perch. It's usually a good sign when you're doing a mini auction and not a lot changes, I think, in terms of an IPL team. In terms of the biggest improvements, actually, I think it might be Punjab. I think they were, if not as bad, possibly even worse than Rajasthan last year at the death. They were quite good in the power play, bowling one with Shami and Sheldon Cottrell. They released did quite well for them in the power play, but it all fell apart completely at the death repeatedly. And they've got in Riley Meredith, they've got in Jai Richardson, who was an obvious one, who was kind of everyone's top pick, really, or nearly everyone's top pick, and they ended up getting him by blowing the bank. Moises Henriques and Fabian Allen provide sort of good all-rounder cover. Again, if they want to shift up the balance, I think they've got a quite decent balance. And I think Punjab could sneak into that final playoff slot and maybe do some damage, just if they can keep the momentum up through the tournament, which they've struggled with. But I think we both think that Mumbai Indians look too strong to beat. Punjab
would have been my second choice in terms of improvements. The one thing being that if Glenn Maxwell was the player we think he is, instead of the Glenn Maxwell from 2020, letting him go is questionable.
I can sort of understand it. It's quite hard to justify that amount of money on someone who did so badly, but then again, it is Glenn Maxwell. Question.
Yeah, the player they needed last year was Glenn Maxwell. Anyway, yeah.
And the final point is that we're yet again in a position where we find players needing two of the player they've already got Delhi need 2 Marcus Stoinis's. Rajasthan, again, need 2 Joss Butlers. But that wraps it up for our little wrap-up of why the English went unsold at this year's IPL auction. Tune in for as much coverage as we can give it on Guerrilla Cricket whenever it starts. And, of course, tune in from next week for ball-by-ball coverage of the 3rd England versus India test from the Modi Dome in Ahmedabad under lights with 55,000 in. But until then, from Jack Hope, it's goodbye.
Cheerio.
And from me, Nakul Pande, and everyone here at Guerrilla Cricket, it's goodbye.
Guerrilla Cricket.
Revolutionary cricket commentary.